The man just tossed the racket in his hand to his apprentice. Unexpectedly, the apprentice was directly knocked to the ground by the racket. It was only because the racket in front of him was forged from meteorite iron. The apprentice asked his teacher in shock why this racket couldn't be lifted, but the teacher suddenly seemed to realize something. He thought the apprentice's arm muscles couldn't bear such heavy weight, so he couldn't lift it. So he threw another racket in his hand to his apprentice, but the apprentice was once again knocked to the ground by the racket. When the apprentice got up again and struggled to pick up the racket, the teacher calmly told the man that the racket he held was only 500 pounds, and he even thought it was light. When the apprentice asked again about the teacher's racket, he heard the teacher calmly tell him that the racket in his hand was just 1,000 pounds. He never could have imagined that the teacher, everyone called useless, actually possessed such astonishing strength. Little did he know, the teacher before him was the world table tennis champion 10 years ago, but grew tired of people's praise, so he chose to retire and become a janitor. The reason he chose the man as his apprentice was simply because he couldn't stand everyone's ridicule. Then the teacher picked up a feather, and with the 500-pound racket, he struck the feather accurately at the bullseye, and the force he used not only shattered the target, but also broke the wall behind it. From then on, the man had to use the 500-pound racket every day to strike feathers. Other students laughed at the man when they saw this, saying directly that he was just a useless person. He couldn't even hold a racket steadily, and yet he wanted to beat them in the assessment. It was nothing but a dream, but what they didn't know was that the racket in his hand actually weighed 500 pounds, but their ridicule only strengthened the man's determination to train. Then he swung hard with a shot, and the feather instantly stuck to the target. The man excitedly looked at the target ahead, eager for his teacher to see his results, but the teacher just chuckled softly, saying directly that he only hit the outer ring. Only hitting the bullseye counted as success. Then he placed the 1,000-pound meteorite racket in front of his apprentice and told him that for the next 3 days, no matter what he did, he had to carry the racket, and he could only put it down with his teacher's permission. Looking at the teacher before him, though he didn't understand why the teacher insisted, the man still agreed. Little did he know, the teacher was secretly praising him in his heart. He hadn't expected that the apprentice turned out to be a genius. Soon, 3 days passed, and the team's assessment was about to begin, and the examiners this time were national-level inspectors. But the news he brought shocked everyone, because if no one passed this assessment, the country would cancel their funding. Everyone immediately grew nervous, but their anxiety didn't stop the assessment from proceeding. Soon, the first round of testing began, but the teacher only held an hourglass in his hand, as if he were timing, and placed it at the corner of the table. At this time, the inspector demonstrated the test standard, which was to strike a ping-pong ball with force and break at least 5 bottles to be considered passing. Soon, a student began the test, but as soon as his ball was hit, it was bounced back by the bottles. Everyone then realized that this assessment was not so easy at all. Next was the student who had just mocked the man. He swung forcefully and hit a ball, and 7 bottles shattered in a row. Everyone was instantly shocked at the scene before them and couldn't help but feel happy for him, and the inspector also declared his result qualified. Soon, it was the apprentice's turn. He nervously looked at the heavy racket in his hand. To secure a spot in the test, he immediately wanted to set it down, but the teacher at his side stopped him. The man could only hold onto the racket and walk up to the examiner. He used all his strength to strike the ball, but because of the racket's weight, he almost fell from the inertia. It was only with the head coach's support that he barely stood steady. But the moment the head coach touched him, he felt the true weight of the racket in the man's hand and looked in disbelief at the man's teacher, exclaiming that he hadn't misjudged him after all. He said directly that the man did very well, but since he only broke 1 bottle, he was still mocked by the other players. Soon, the second test also began. This time, it was about accuracy. 10 fire rings would shrink smaller and smaller. If the ball could pass through 5 rings, it was considered passing. And this time, the first to go was the student who mocked the man. He swung steadily with a shot and achieved 8 rings. The examiner also declared it passing. The students went up one after another, but none of them passed. Only the last one left was the man. He swung with all his strength, but was nearly dragged down by the racket's weight. It was the examiner who held him up so he didn't crash into the nearby table, but when the examiner held the man's hand, it trembled noticeably. He couldn't help but feel shocked. Next came the third round of the test, But the examiner's test was actual combat. If anyone could win 5 points against a national-level player, they would be considered the winner. Just when everyone thought it was easy, they saw the one competing against them was actually the apprentice ranked 3rd in the world. With just a simple swing of his racket, he injured a student's eye. Everyone was shocked as they looked at the apprentice, and just as another player wanted to step up, the coach stopped her and decided to go up himself. But after just a few exchanges, the coach was knocked to the ground. At this moment, the man trembled as he held his heavy racket and decided to compete with the apprentice. Very quickly, the man lost 4 points, but when he asked his teacher if he could change rackets, the teacher said that until the hourglass ran out, he could not switch. The man could only stand up and endure to face his 5th ball.
Wow, interesting. If you want more stories like this, subscribe for the full video.